Let's go. Elaine Wilson, our board chair. Elaine, would you stand up from Somerset, who's made the trip down here for this event? Thank you. And last but not least, we want to thank Congressman Brett Guthrie for being here tonight and for being such a great supporter of the Library of Congress and the humanities in Washington. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Brett Guthrie.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be brief because I'm between you and the Poet Laureate, so I will, Poet Laureates, as I guess that's the plural, or Poets Laureate? Yeah, that's the right way to do it. Get my words right, this is what I'm going to talk about. Well, thanks so much, and I want to talk about, I use the Library of Congress. I enjoy all the programs they have at the Library of Congress. I think we all know the story, they get everything published. So it's volumes and volumes and warehouses and not even in the buildings that you can see in Washington. But there's a lot of interesting things that you get to do there. And I've talked to a lot of fifth graders because, not that I think I'm smarter than the fifth grader, but the fifth grade does government in Kentucky. And they talk about the Constitution. And so I always ask the question, if you were a citizen of what country were you a citizen of before July 4th, 1776? And of course they all answer Great Britain or England. And I said, it's a trick question. You weren't quite a citizen, you were a subject. And I try to use that to explain being a citizen of a republic is different than being the subject of a king. So I was at the Library of Congress one night, so I've said that for quite a few years, and I'm standing there, and they took us through where they do all of the restoration, how they do the documents, the value documents of our republic, and they had their handwritten Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. Now the one you see in the archives is the one that was proclaimed and actually in August, even though it was on July 4th. But Thomas Jefferson obviously had a rough draft. So we had the rough draft. And we were looking at it, and they were showing us how something they learned. And in the rough draft it said, "My fellow citizens." But it was blotted. You could tell it was blotted. Back then he was written with ink, and if he wrote something wrong, he'd have to blot it out and try to get rid of the ink under it and then write over it. Well, they never really knew what was under citizens because you're not going to erase it to find out until this new equipment they have, and they were showing, they blew it up. And you could read under the shadow of what he wrote. So Thomas Jefferson's original sentence was, "My fellow subjects." He blotted it out and put "my fellow citizens." So I stood there in awe going, wow, Thomas Jefferson thinks like I do. I'm kidding, other way around. I'm not that arrogant, I promise you that very much. But the point is words, and that's why we're here tonight, words matter. The things people say matters. And the way you use words matter. And I know a lot of you are from around here, that I've always tried to be careful the way I speak about things. You can disagree without being disagreeable. That's always been the way that I look. And so my favorite kind of quote that I use is from Proverbs 25. And it's one of my favorite quotes of all. It says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pitchers of silver." So what I believe, the God who designed this, said words matter. The way you speak to people matters. A proper word in the right place is valuable, and it is more precious than gold and more precious than silver. And so Paul Simon wrote a song one time and said, "Somewhere in a burst of glory, a sound becomes a song." Well, somewhere in a burst of glory, words become poems, they become speeches, they become the way that we can move forward. So the Library of Congress asked me how does poetry relate to public service, and I'm going to share this and I'll sit down. I've just finished a biography, a 3-volume biography of Teddy Roosevelt and one of Winston Churchill, and they were great quoters of poets. And I said, I don't know if I can go figure out where the scene was in those 6 volumes to go through, so I was trying to figure out exactly how I could find what I wanted to share. And I was standing on the House floor day before yesterday, and there was a group of Western students who came, and one wanted to meet John Lewis. Some of you are familiar with John Lewis. He's the last of the original 8 speakers of the March on Washington. Dear man, he was a fraternity brother of Mr. Lewis. And Mr. Lewis went to Fisk. He's a Western, not at the same time, but a fraternity brother, and he wanted to do the secret handshake. And so I went down on the floor to see Mr. Lewis, and I was talking to him, and I was kind of thinking of what I wanted to say tonight. And then Joseph Kennedy III walked by. And think about 50 years ago, almost today, was when Dr. King was assassinated. And one of the the most moving things that I remember ever seeing of Joe Kennedy's grandfather, who's Robert Kennedy. He was campaigning for president in Indianapolis, was about to give a speech. And he walked onto the podium and told the crowd, though nobody knew because it had just happened, that Dr. King had been assassinated. And he quoted a poem to quieten the crowd, to get his point across. And Indianapolis, because of Robert Kennedy and the way he used words, didn't have some of the issues that understandably exploded in some of the other cities with the anger of what happened with Dr. King. And I just want to, and I usually read off the phone, and I knew if I said it here long enough, I have to go back. Here we go. It says, so Robert Kennedy walks onto the stage and tells him Dr. King had just passed away. And what he says was, he goes, I want to quote from my favorite poet. He quoted this from memory, so poetry is important. I want to quote from my favorite poet, Acilius. He wrote, and I quote, in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. Then he went on to say, these are Senator Kennedy's words, what we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or black. Then he finished his sentence, he went on, but he finished his speech with, let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. So poetry has its place in the public space, and hopefully it encourages us and inspires us to be better than ourselves. Thank you very much. I look forward to the night.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Tracy K. Smith. Tracy K. Smith was appointed as the Library of Congress's 22nd Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry in June of 2017. Born in Falmouth, Massachusetts and raised in Fairfield, California, Smith earned a BA from Harvard University and an MFA in creative writing from Columbia University. She is currently a professor of creative writing at Princeton. Smith is the author of 3 award-winning books of poetry that have earned her the Literary Award, the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, the Essence Award, the Cave Canon Award, the James Laughlin Award. Her memoir was a finalist for the National Book Award and selected as a notable book by the New York Times and the Washington Post. In just a couple of weeks, Tracy's 4th poetry collection, Wade in the Water, will be published. We all think that you'll want to pick it up as soon as you can, maybe at the Kentucky Book Fair on November the 17th. She's been extended an invitation to join us in November. Tracy is the latest in a long line of talented and distinguished poets who have accepted the responsibility that comes with the title of Poet Laureate, to foster awareness and appreciation for poetry among all Americans. So far during this project, Tracy Smith has traveled to Utah, New Mexico, and South Carolina, reaching populations that are sometimes underexposed to poetry. We at Kentucky Humanities feel a special kinship with Tracy. As Kentucky's new Center for the Book, we are bound, unintended, to bring poetry and literature to all Kentuckies. We want to thank Tracy for choosing the Commonwealth as a stop on this important tour. Tonight you'll hear from Tracy Smith in a reading, following a discussion with Tracy and Fred Smock on the role of the Poet Laureate, moderated by Rob Casper, who is the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tracy K. Smith.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really just so grateful to be here. Is my microphone working in the back? Yes? Okay. I love the idea of beginning with what I think is true, the statement that poetry puts us in mind of our better selves. It's language that urges us to listen humbly and actively for what is often difficult to see and admit. And I feel like it's a really beautiful way of life. I feel very lucky that I get to encounter the world with this tool, and I feel very grateful to be able to talk about it and share it with other people who are interested. And so I'm grateful to be here. I'm going to read from my new book, which will be out in April, and it's called Wade in the Water. And I feel like that's the right choice because it's a book that's really seeking a way into the lesson of compassion and love that Representative Guthrie was talking about, that Bobby Kennedy so eloquently urged. And I think these poems are seeking to do that in different ways. Some through history, looking backward at moments in American history where compassion wasn't the prevailing, demeanor. And looking, I think, honestly at my own life in the present moment and looking for ways that, that path might veer toward love and an understanding of others as opposed to what often is the reality, annoyance or frustration or dismissal, because life is full of so many demands. So I'll read from around in the book. I'll begin with a poem called Hill Country. One of the really beautiful things about getting to travel on these trips is seeing how the landscape changes from one region in the country to another. This is a poem that's set in Texas, but the nature of Kentucky that I've seen in the, 6 hours since I've been here has been glorious. I bought some dirt to take home with me. Hill Country, and maybe what I'll say, and then I'll shut up and read, is that I feel a sense of the holy, and at the very least a model for something that feels like a mindfulness in nature that I wish to learn from. Hill Country. He comes down from the hills, from the craggy rock, the shrubs, the scrawny live oaks and dried up junipers, down from the cloud bellies and the bellies of hawks, from the caracaras stalking carcasses, from the clear, sun-smacked soundlessness that shrouds him, from the weathered bed of planks outside the cabin where he goes to be alone with his questions. God comes down along the road with his windows unrolled so the twigs and hanging vines can slap and scrape against him in his Jeep. Down past the buck caught in the hog trap that kicks and heaves, bloodied, blinded by the whiff of its own death, which God, thank God, staves off. He downshifts, crosses the shallow trickle of river that only just last May scoured the side of the canyon to rock, gets out, walks along the limestone bank, castor beans, cactus, scat of last night's coyotes. Down below the hilltops, he squints out at shadow, tree backing tree. Dark depth the eye glides across, not bothering to decipher what it hides. A pair of dragonflies mate in flight. Tiny flowers throw frantic color at his feet. If he tries, if he holds his mind in place and wills it, he can almost believe in something larger than himself, rearranging the air. He squints at the Jeep glaring in bright sun, stares a while at patterns the tall branches cast onto the undersides of leaves. Then God climbs back into the cab, returning to everywhere. I'll read another, a kind of nature poem. This is called Deadly. It's a poem that's one sentence long, and I tell my students, I believe this is true, that if ever a poem is one sentence long, no matter what it purports to be about, it's also about time, and I think that's true in this poem. This is called Deadly. The holy thinks tiger, then watches the thing wriggle, divide, stagger up out of the sea to rise on legs and tear into the side of a loping gazelle. Thinks man and witnesses the armies of trees and every nation of beast and the wide, furious ocean and the epochs of rock tremble. I'm going to read the title poem. I'll tell you a little bit about where this poem comes from. I attended a performance of a ring shout in Georgia about 1 year ago. And as you may know, that's an African-American tradition of spiritual songs that are also transmitting a sense of history, the history of blacks through slavery in this country, but it's also a performance style that bears a lot of connection to West African percussion tradition and ecstatic tradition. And those songs, as you know, are on one level, on the surface level, they're songs about praise and about redemption and about God delivering you to safety. And on a deeper level, there are songs that have messages embedded for slaves who were seeking freedom. So the song Wade in the Water is not just saying, you know, God's going to trouble the water, God will deliver you, but it's saying walk in the water so that your scent will be lost and you can't be pursued by dogs. So there's a lot of embedded meaning in these songs. It's a heavy history to contend with, and one of the things that moved me so deeply about this performance, in addition to the music, was one of the performers who, before everything started, greeted me and every other stranger that she met by saying, "I love you," and giving us a hug. And it was a really beautiful gesture. It didn't feel like a stunt. It felt like what a large-hearted person does. And I didn't want to let go of that feeling of gratitude, so this is the poem that helped me to dwell upon it. Wade in the Water, for the Geechee Gullah ring shouters. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her. And a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you, I love you," as she continued down the hall, past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you," throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. "I love you" in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. "I love you" in the water where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. "I love you," the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous, many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord, is this love the trouble you promised? I was trying to write a Thomas Jefferson poem for a long time. I was invited to participate in an anthology of poems about Jefferson, and I wrote a sonnet, and I knew, my ear told me that the last line was wrong. It just wasn't right, but I couldn't fix it, so I gave it to them. And then when I was coming to work on this book, I said, maybe I can fix that. And I added to the sonnet, I added a few different sections, thinking I'll make a whole suite of Jefferson poems. And then I said, maybe if I look at some of his letters and his will, I can make a found poem using bits of his language in a different way. And then I said, maybe I could do that with the Declaration of Independence. And I sat down and thinking about the way that Jefferson addressed his fellow subjects and the complaint against the British monarchy, I started to hear something that felt so relevant to African American life in this country. And so I eliminated the specifics of time and place. And I was kind of haunted or chilled by what I heard. So I'm going to share that poem with you and then maybe shift into one other poem about history. This is called Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear I'm going to read you two brief excerpts from another history-based poem. A number of years ago, the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian had an exhibition commemorating the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And they invited a dozen poets to write poems about the Civil War. And I was curious to learn about the experience of African American soldiers during that conflict. And I found a couple of books that had letters that soldiers wrote to their family members, that their family members wrote to Abraham Lincoln asking for information, asking for help. And then another book that recorded transcriptions of testimonies that African American veterans had given after the war, and sometimes their widows and sometimes their children, well into the 20th century in an attempt to claim pensions. Now, if you think about it, someone who was born into slavery was not given a birth certificate, didn't have a marriage license, didn't have a divorce record, and if you chose to change your name after emancipation, there wasn't a paper trail that could say, oh, you are now the same person that you were then. And because of this, many people were denied the pensions that they as veterans should have been due. I thought I would read all of this material and write my own poem about this story. But the more I read, the more I felt that these voices were so powerful, so full of dignity and belief in the institutions of American democracy, that I didn't feel my voice had any place in it. So I kind of created a chorus of actual voices and letters. And I'm going to just read you two sections that gather many voices together. And what I hear them telling is a single story. So this poem is called, I Will Tell You the Truth About This. I Will Tell You All About It. Excellent Sir, my son went in the 54th Regiment. Sir, my husband, who is in Company K, 22nd Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, and now in the Macon Hospital at Portsmouth with a wound in his arm, has not received any pay since last May, and then only $13. Sir, we, the members of Company D of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteers, call the attention of Your Excellency to our case. For instance, look and see that we never was freed yet, run right out of slavery, into soldiery, and we had nothing at all. And our wives and mother, most all of them is a perishing all about, and we all are perishing ourselves. I am willing to be a soldier and serve my time faithful like a man. But I think it is hard to be put off in such doggish manner as that. Will you see that the colored men fighting now are fairly treated? You ought to do this, and do it at once, not let the thing run along. Lead it quickly and manfully. We poor oppressed ones appeal to you and ask fair play. So please, if you can do any good for us, do it in the name of God. Excuse my boldness, but please, your reply will settle the matter and will be appreciated by a colored man who is willing to sacrifice his son in the cause of freedom and humanity. I have nothing more to say, hoping that you will lend a listening ear to an humble soldier. I will close. Yours, for Christ's sake. I shall have to send this without a stamp, for I hain't money enough to buy a stamp. I am 60-odd years of age. I am 62 years of age next month. I am about 65 years of age. I reckon I am about 67 years old. I am about 68 years of age. I am on the rise of 80 years of age. I am 89 years old. I am 94 years of age. I don't know my exact age. I am the claimant in this case. I have testified before you 2 different times before. I filed my claim, I think, first about 12 years ago. I am now an applicant for a pension because I understand that all soldiers are entitled to a pension. I claim pension under the general law on account of disease of eyes as a result of smallpox contracted in service. The varicose veins came on both my legs soon after the war, and the sores were there when I first put in my claim. I claim pension for rheumatism and got my toe broke, and I was struck in the side with the breech of a gun, breaking my ribs. I was a man stout and healthy, over 27 years of age when I enlisted. When I enlisted, I had a little mustache and some chin whiskers. I was a green boy right off the farm and did just what I was told to do. When I went to enlist, the recruiting officer said to me, "Your name is John Wilson." I said, "No, my name is Robert Harrison." But he put me down as John Wilson. I was known while in service by that name. I cannot read nor write, and I do not know how my name was spelled when I enlisted, nor do I know how it is spelled now. I always signed my name while in the Army by making my mark. I know my name by sound. My mother said after my discharge that the reason the officer put my name down as John Wilson was he could draw my bounty. I am the son of Solomon and Lucinda Sibley. I am the only living child of Dennis Campbell. My father was George Jordan, and my mother was Millie Jordan. My mother told me that John Barnett was my father. My mother was Mary Eliza Jackson, and my father, Reuben Jackson. My name on the roll was Frank Nunn. No, sir, it was not Frank Nern. My full name is Dick Lewis Barnett. I am the applicant for pension on account of having served under the name Lewis Smith. which was the name I wore before the days of slavery were over. My correct name is Hiram Kirkland. Some persons call me Harry, and others call me Henry, but neither is my correct name. So I think looking backward has also made me more conscious of what I see, how I perceive the people around me now. And I'll read a couple of poems that bear witness to the struggle of caring enough or ceding some of my own sense of importance when other people are in the picture. These are two kind of companion poems this one's called Beatific. I like poetry because it allows you to be your best self, but you can also be honest about your real self, which is sometimes not so noble. Beatific. I watch him bob across the intersection, squat legs bowed in black sweatpants. I watch him smile at nobody, at our traffic stopped to accommodate his slow going. His arms churn the air. His comic jog carries him nowhere, but it is as if he hears a voice in our idling engines, calling him live, swift, prince of creation. Every least leaf shivers in the sun, while we sit, bothered, late, captive to this thing commanding, wait for this man, wait for him. Charity. She is like a squat old machine, off kilter, but still chugging along the uphill stretch of sidewalk on Harrison Street, handbag slung crosswise, and, I'm guessing, heavy. And oh, the set of her face, her brows profound tracks, her mouth cinched, lips pressed flat. Watching her bend forward to tussle with gravity, watching the birth she allows each foot as if one is not on civil terms with the other, watching her shoulders braced as if lashed by step after step after step, and her eyes' determination not to shift or blink or rise. I think I am you, one day out of 5, tired, empty, hating what I carry but afraid to lay it down, stingy, angry, doing violence to others by the sheer freight of my gloom, halfway home, wanting to stop, to quit, but keeping going mostly out of spite. Just out of excitement for our conversation, I'll conclude with this brief poem, which is called An Old Story. I think this is an attempt to write a new myth. An old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate, swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream, the worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals long believed gone crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress, and I'm also delighted to be here with the U.S. Poet Laureate and Kentucky's own Poet Laureate, Frederick Smock. Let me tell you a little bit about your laureate. Frederick Smock earned his BA at Georgetown College and his MA at the University of Louisville. He is the author of 7 collections of poetry and 4 books of prose. Smock is the recipient of the 2005 Wilson Wyatt Faculty Award at Bellarmine University, the Al Smith Fellowship in Poetry from the Kentucky Arts Council, and the Jim Wayne Miller Prize for Poetry from Western Kentucky University. He was appointed Poet Laureate of Kentucky in 2017. Smock is an associate professor of English and director of the creative writing program at Bellarmine University in Louisville. He is also a member of the Kentucky Humanities Speakers Bureau. So please join me in welcoming Frederick Smock, your Poet Laureate. So the title of this moderated discussion, which we'll do for a little bit, and then I want to give you the opportunity to ask both the Kentucky Poet Laureate and the U.S. Poet Laureate any questions you might have, is the role of the Poet Laureate. But really specifically, I wanted to talk about outreach to rural communities. I know that only 2 states, I think, in the country don't have a state poet laureate, but not every poet laureate does what I've heard the Kentucky Poet Laureate has done, traveling around the state, giving readings, connecting to communities large and small. And maybe we could begin by just, Mr. Smock, you talking about the work you've done in the position at connecting to rural communities.
Well, when I was asked, when I was asked to take on the role, I was encouraged to accept every invitation that I could to speak or read or travel around. And I've taken that very seriously. And it's taken me across the state and back. And it's been a lovely experience. And one of the things that I've found is that out in the state, once you get away from Louisville, Lexington, and Frankfort, there's a real hunger for poetry. And when you think about it, when we were children, we loved poetry. And somehow there's a disconnect that comes in at some point. I remember my older son was in the yard, maybe 5 years old, stabbing things with a stick. Bushes, not the dog, you know. And I made this sort of dumb father comment that looks like a cruel sword, simile. And he stopped what he was doing and he looked at me with his gray green eyes and he said, "It is a sword," a metaphor. So kids get it, and part of the joy in speaking to groups, especially student groups, is to reconnect them to that joy that poetry can provide. So that's been a real thrill for me.
Maybe we could talk a little bit more about what you describe as the hunger outside of the urban areas of Kentucky. And maybe, Tracy, you could talk about it too in the trips that you've had, New Mexico, South Carolina, and out here in Kentucky. The hunger that you see when you travel to these rural communities, and how that plays out in the conversations you have with people.
Okay. Well, I'm really struck by how eager and grateful people are in communities where there isn't a lot of existing programming, and you know, they come for various reasons. For poetry, maybe they write poetry, maybe they are curious about what poetry would sound like in such a format, maybe they are well, in some of the communities that I visited, people have said, "I want my kids to see someone who looks like you in this position. That's why we're here." And I also have been delighted to see all of the different versions of community that are represented, people who are coming from schools together, or people who go to the same churches and they come together. And it makes me feel like what is shared in a poetry reading and conversation isn't confined to literature. You know, poetry is a vehicle for listening and for coming together, and in a way, some of the sense of welcome and hospitality that I, feel here, and it's different in some ways from what it feels like to give a reading as part of a series that has been going on for decades in places where people are used to having to choose between which literary event they'll go to. There's a real sense of a gathering and a sense of eagerness that I think is beautiful. I've only so far done a handful, 3 official trips through the library, and then a number of unofficial rural trips that are the result of invitations from communities who have said, okay, we're going to get all the 7th graders in this district in one place, and you come read to them. I feel very humbled and moved by that, to think that the work of language is something that can be so vital that people will, move mountain-like things in order to bring it to their place.
Just the other day, I was in Frankfort, Kentucky, judging the Poetry Out Loud competition, which is a national program that states can opt in for. And there were 16 high school students who had won the title at their high school, and they were in Frankfurt. They had memorized, each of them, 3 poems, and they recited those poems. And they were so good, they were so talented. And I was just thrilled to see students, and none of these students were from Louisville, Lexington, or Frankfurt. They were all from out in the state. And so many of them so completely inhabited their poems that it was really almost transcendent. And one of the best parts was that many of them had classmates come to the event and cheer them on as though it was a basketball game. So I love to see it sort of disseminate out into the world and actually reach all of these students so that they're not lost without what poetry gives them.
I wonder, are there poems, your own or others, that you feel, that you've read, that you feel that speak in some powerful, unique way to rural communities?
Well, one of the things, I kind of lost my train of thought a second ago, but the one thing I was going to say is I've done a few trips, and I don't yet know what I would say characterizes a rural community. I don't know if there's a thing other than the fact that it's not a city, and maybe nature or landscape is something that people live with as opposed to remote from. But I feel like every place I've gone, it's been different. I've shared a lot of poems that don't have so much to do with place, but like kind of a moment of clarity, a private moment of clarity. And I'm excited to see what people see and hear in poems. There's always a little distance of poem travels, right? The speaker is speaking perhaps from real experience. The reader follows that, receives that, but then there's also a moment where the reader says, this reminds me of this thing in my life, and so the poem gets pulled a little bit closer. It's interesting to see how that changes based on the age of who's reading the poem or the circumstances. We just did an event this afternoon with people who are dealing with addiction, and so the poems, even that were not about substance abuse, were pulled to a place where they were capable of speaking to that, which I think is one of the miracles of poetry. It gives, it allows you to find yourself within the story.
It can be difficult to know how a poem is received unless you talk with people afterwards, which doesn't always happen. There's a Navajo saying, I know what gift I have given, I do not know what gift has been received. And when I talk to my students, I tell them, look, you're the only authority on what any of these poems mean to you. Not me, not the poet, not the critics, you. You do something with this poem. I read a story about a woman in Texas, a poet, who for some reason took the Texas high school standardized exam, and there was a question in the literature section about one of her poems, and it was asking what was the author's intent in writing it. And she got the question wrong. So, somewhere, I think it's important to empower the readers to do whatever they want to do with that poem. And at that point, it's not mine anymore, it's theirs.
Well, I've been talking a lot about rural communities, but I wanted to expand the conversation a little bit to talk about how poems may connect rural and urban communities, whatever we might define them as. Are they vehicles for conversation between Kentuckians, Americans who live in small towns and live in big metropolises?
I hope so. Now, is there always a forum for that conversation to take place? I don't know. I feel lucky because I'm sort of a former city person who gets to be in the middle of this conversation when I come to a place. But it's happening in real time, and I'm there. But I think what poems do, and this is why I think I read them, and this is why I write them, they allow the deep private voice of feeling and thought and something that isn't exactly language, something that doesn't fit exactly into language. They allow that to rise to the surface. And so I can find myself in a poem, even if it's spoken by or written by somebody who has nothing ostensibly to do with me, because I have a deep private inner life as well. And at that depth, I'm not so very different from another person. That's what I think is really exciting about poems. I don't know that, in some ways you could call that a universal quality. I like to think of it as just a deep human quality that we share, and that sometimes the surface layers of our lives cause us to forget. The surface differences between us cause us to forget.
And poems come from who knows where. When I was a kid, I grew up in Fern Creek, Kentucky, which was then not a suburb of Louisville. And somehow I found my way to the novels of the Appalachian writer Jesse Stewart. And I would read those books, and then I would sort of act them out in the woods around my house. So I think there is a humanness that connects all of us, regardless of whether you live in a city or in the country. And a poem exists where nothing existed before. And as an example, when my son was in grade school, I went in to do Poetry Day, and one of my ideas was to go to the grocery and gather a bag of the strangest fruits and vegetables I could find. They each got to pick one, play with it, get to know it, and then I asked them a series of questions that they were to answer in the voice of the fruit or vegetable they had chosen. Like, who is broccoli's best friend? And I still remember the girl who picked the coconut. There wasn't much she could do with it. She could feel the hair on the outside, she could shake it and hear the milk slosh around on the inside. And the last question I asked them was, where do you like to go on vacation? And this 10-year-old girl wrote, I never have to go on vacation because I carry the waves inside me. And every kid in the room did just what you did. I think there's this common human thing that connects us through this special language that we call poetry.
Let me see if you all have some questions to ask your duo of Poets Laureate. Anybody have any questions out there? Don't be shy. Someone? Yeah.
Both write poetry as children?
Rob, what's your...
So yeah, the question is, did both of our Poets Laureate read poetry as children?
Right.
Sorry, write poetry. Of course you read poetry as children.
I liked to write rhymes and things when I was little, and then when I was in the 5th grade, I read a poem by Emily Dickinson, and I thought, oh, that's so wise. I'm going to write wisdom now. And I started trying to write poems that were meaningful. And it wasn't until I was a young adult that I really started reading a lot of poetry and studying the ways that poets meet poems and trying to do that systematically. It started out as just joy, you know.
My friend Wendell Berry and I were on a panel, and he got the question, how did you get started writing poetry? And Wendell's answer was, well, there was this girl, see. and I did. I wrote as a child, and I think I went through a phase where I wanted to be a rock and roll lyricist, and then I kind of slid sideways into poetry. But yeah, I think if anybody's fascinated with language and captivated by language, you just get drawn into it.
I find that and this is still what I love, it teaches me things, it allows me to teach myself things that I didn't know. It's my imagination, my vocabulary, it's my, time and work, and yet somehow from where I begin, I end up discovering something that I hadn't already known, and that feels like magic every single time. And then when I read other poets, they show me how the world is different, larger and smaller and stranger and more familiar than I thought. And those lessons stay with me.
I think that's where poetry kind of closes the gap between what can be said and what can't be said. There's a poem of mine that I give to my students, and I tell them, I don't really understand the last two lines. It's a poem about two bees who were doing it, and I watched. And then later on, I just wrote down what I told them, and then this line just popped into my head, that after they were done, the grass, the air, now sweet with the honey of future days. Which is not a line you could think of logically. It's an illogical line, but I think it has deeper meaning than logic could hold. Mm-hmm. And I tell them, don't ask me what that means. I don't even want to think about that. You just take it and go do something with it. Yeah.
I'm wondering, and as a sort of piggyback to that question, when was the first time you encountered a poet laureate, read a poet laureate, thought about the position, and what has the position meant to you? What have you discovered about that role inhabiting it?
I think the first time I was conscious of the poet laureateship was with Rita Dove. I was in graduate school in the mid-90s, and I went to a reading. I had been reading her poems and trying to metabolize them and rate them or somehow. And so I went to a reading that she gave, and I remember her talking about wanting to get people into the library and creating a reading series that would bring people in. And there was food, and she said sometimes I started noticing people coming and they would stay back by the food. But they came back, and then they moved up a little bit more, and then they were buying books or, talking to the writers, and that felt like a triumph. I think my sense of it through the years now, witnessing people who have had projects and the way that those projects have brought them into contact with other Americans, I feel like it's a really wonderful opportunity to talk about the marvelous things that poetry gives us a vocabulary for, and the quiet but meaningful places in our lives that we don't always share or talk about. It's a way of saying our life and our, the demands of modern life are X, Y, and Z. It's fast, it's loud, it's stressful, it's confusing, and it's not always transparent. But if you want, you can turn the volume down on that and listen to this other thing, and it's the honey of future days. That's what you understand that, and you can live with that if you want.
Kentucky's always had a very robust state poet laureate position, and I've known a number of them over the years. And also at Bellarmine, running a lecture series, I brought some poet laureates to campus, including Billy Collins and Robert Pinsky. We brought the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz to campus. And one of the highlights of that evening was he was asked to read a few poems in Polish, which none of us understood. But he read them, and they were very moving, even though we didn't know what he was saying. And it sometimes reminds me of Catholic congregations, and there are a few I've read about, who switched from Mass in Latin to Mass in English. And the Mass in English was no longer a spiritual experience because they understood everything. And they switched back to Latin. and it became a spiritual experience again. So there's this great capacity for mystery in our lives that sometimes we don't want to deal with, but it's there.
I think something also happens when, okay, so there's so many of the joys of reading that happen privately, but when you're in a space like this and you're listening together to a common text, you know, a voice, even if you don't understand it, you're in something together, you're sharing something, you're making something together, and that feels urgently important. You know, we don't do that, and even if we don't talk about what it means to be there, kind of breathing and waiting and vulnerable and satisfied together, I think that is something. I think that's important.
That's a good point. Reading is such a private experience for most of us, but we turn out for these kinds of events, and we take in whatever we take in, and everyone goes away with a different experience. And I think that just multiplies the experience. I wouldn't want it to be a singular thing. I'm kind of happy that everyone goes off in a different direction, like cats refusing to be herded. Although you can herd cats, I've heard that you can use a laser thing, and they'll all go in the same direction.
It's called Facebook.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you all read someone else's poetry at home privately, do you read it out loud or silently? And why or why either way?
Did you hear that in the back? You heard in the back? The question was, do you read other people's poems out loud or silently?
I do both. I like to sit and read books, and then I like to read the poems aloud sometimes. And I teach poems to my students who are writing, but you can't write unless you read. So they'll read the books at home, and then before we talk about a poem, we have to read it aloud so that we can kind of enter back into the presence of it, the voice.
I like doing both. I like reading it privately, and I also like giving voice to it, putting my breath through the poem. There's almost nothing compared to hearing the poet him or herself read their work. When I brought Billy Collins to campus, you read up on these people so that you can handle the affair. And there was one poem of his that I read quietly at home to myself. I totally did not get the humor of it. I was thinking, wow, deep, serious poem. And then he comes to campus and reads it, and everyone's laughing their butts off. And I'm like, how did I miss that? But it's the poet who gives his or her own breath to that poem that maybe is the way that it should be heard. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Who are your current favorite poets and why?
So it's, who are your favorite current poets and why?
Tracy K. Smith.
Me too, me too.
I love Rita Dove. I once rode up in an elevator with Rita Dove at a conference and was just thrilled for like the next 3 days. I really like Mary Oliver. I like Olaf Hadje, who's a Norwegian poet, no longer around. But I found a book of his, and I wrote an entire book of poems in response to his book of poems. So sometimes there's this wonderful, deep conversation that happens, because art comes from art. I have had students tell me, I like to write poetry, but I don't like to read it. And I'm thinking, who are you, Michael Jordan? You just show up on game day? And it's not the way it works.
Can you spell his name? His last name?
Olavhauge. And I think Copper Canyon published him.
I feel like my list changes a lot, but you said current. Lucille Clifton is a poet who will just be on that list for me for the ages now. I love that she's a poet of the minute and the local and the private and the cosmic at the same time. And her poems are really committed to Black life, and they're also really committed to, I think, just the role of humans in the universe and what we must do to become better. I love Marie Howe's poetry, which I think is so philosophical and effortless feeling, but it's it's not effortless. I hope she puts work into those poems. Linda Gregg is another poet who's, I like poems that kind of help me live in a way. Those aren't always the poems that I teach to my students, but when I need poetry, it's the poems that are speaking to what is meaning, you know, how can I just keep doing this thing? So those are some that are, I think, kind of.
I'm always moving on to new poets. I mean, you're always cycling through different people. I've been through a Linda Paston phase. I've been through a Jack Gilbert phase, a wonderful poet from Pittsburgh. And poets like that are poets who help you live.
Yeah.
Jack Gilbert has a poem about the death of his wife and the grief he carries around, and he keeps shifting it around his body so that nothing gets overtired, but also so that he never has to put it down. And when you get insights like that, I mean, you just tuck that away and carry it around with you, and who knows what it does for you, but it does something for you clearly.
Yeah, there are a lot of new voices, or more contemporary voices. I was reminded as we were driving through that Ada Limon lives in Kentucky. Where does she live? She lives
Lexington, I think.
Lexington. I'm really excited by some younger poets. A poet named Eve Ewing, who lives in Chicago. A poet named Jenny Xie, Xie is her last name, who lives in New York.
Well, in Kentucky, Louisville, I don't know if it's Louisville or Kentucky, we have a youth poet laureate whose name is Hannah Drake. And she's quite something. She has videos and a website, and you should really check her out. She's maybe 18 years old, but she has a real voice, and she's very much out there on social issues. I tried to get her to come here, but I couldn't contact her. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's your favorite poem that you have written and why?
What's your favorite poem that you've written and what?
And why?
And why? There you go. That's a tough one.
I tend to feel so grateful to the last poem that I've written. I'm so proud of it, even the same way I did when I was in the 5th grade, like, I did it. So maybe one of the last poems that I wrote in this book would be a poem about a visit I took to China recently called Eternity. And I like that it allowed me to relive that and then think about connections between people, unlikely connections.
Mine is always the next poem. It's always my favorite. But sometimes a line, and it's hard to claim ownerships of poems because I often feel like a poet just reads and muses about things and then language just pops into their head. And so where does it come from? I don't know. Recently my college inaugurated a new president, and I was commissioned to write a poem for the inauguration. And I thought, oh no. But I actually came up with something, and the beginning part of that poem was, if I can remember it, the moon appears in my window as a beautiful stranger whose mood I cannot guess. And I don't even know what that means, but I just really like the language.
I have a question for you about the peace poem. You said can you tell you're supposed to read this, and you said you don't know the last 2 lines. You said, go and do something with this. So what is the exercise that they have to do?
So there's a question about the exercise that's based on Mr. Smock's poem, the peace poem they talked about the last 2 lines.
Yes. Well, there's no specific exercise. I just kind of turn them loose into the day. But they write reflection papers for me. And a number of them have written reflection papers about the bees poem. And they go off in all these different directions. And I'm glad for all of them. I don't want to corral them into one interpretation. Like, when a teacher asks you, as I was asked in high school so many times, to find the hidden meaning of a poem, we know what's up. The teacher's sitting on a privileged interpretation, and you have to guess what he or she's thinking. That's just no fun, and I don't think it has any educational value. So go off in your own directions, and I've gotten really wild interpretations of those last 2 lines, but I'm not going to argue with any of them.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've always been curious, do you title all of your poems, and if so, since that's not part of the poem, what is the purpose of your titles?
Ooh, that question about titling poems.
I think it is a part of the poem.
Okay.
I think it's that your first experience of the poem is this thing that's usually bigger or bolder. It's up top, it has extra space, so it's like this kind of dramatic moment, and the title raises a question in your mind. It says something, and maybe it's something that seems very straightforward, and so it creates either a question or an expectation. And then you drop that little moment of suspense, you drop into the poem, and you enter into what I think of as like the world of the poem. And that expectation is met, it's deflected, the question is answered directly, or it's indirectly answered, or something else. And I think it's part of the experience of the poem. Sometimes my titles say, this is where the poem is coming from. And it'll be useful because the poem isn't straightforward. Or the poem is so straightforward that my title is going to give you some auxiliary idea or feeling that will complement what the poem is doing. And then sometimes the title is doing something else. But I think of it as the first opportunity, and I usually write it after the poem is done. So I get to think, what do I want to offer the reader as that first, the first glimpse of this thing.
I've had lots of interesting conversations with students about how to title their poems. And, is the title the name of the poem? Is it the door to the poem, the foyer? I don't think I'm very good at titles, and so my new book, all the poems are untitled.
Are they called Untitled?
No. Well, the convention in an untitled poem, if it's in a journal or something, is you pull the first line up and put it in italics within brackets, but mine don't even have that. It's just 5 lines on the page, like tossing into the deep end and saying swim.
Another couple questions, yeah.
In terms of physically writing, do you schedule specific hours in the day where, hey, on Wednesday from 9 to 5, I'm going to sit down and write something? Or is it more fluid where you'll write just when the inspiration or the idea strikes?
Yeah, question about just writing time, when you have it and how scheduled it is.
Completely unscheduled. You kind of cannot, in my experience, you can't sit down and make yourself write poetry. Essays, yes, but Randall Jarrell, a poet in the 50s, said that a poet is someone who sits down at a desk and hopes to be struck by lightning. So you cannot make these things happen. William Stafford would get up early in the morning, his desk was faced into a window, and he would not try to write, he has said. What he would do was wait for the day to give him something, an image, anything that he could kind of take off on. And he said he wrote a poem every day, and not all of them were good, by his admission. But everyone evokes their own method, really, as far as I know.
I try and sit myself down to work on things because I feel like it's useful to me. I feel better, helps me wrestle with the things that I'm wondering about or bothered by. Even if I don't have an idea in mind, when I have the time, I know that if I can go through the motions of saying the wrong thing for about 15 minutes or an hour, or whatever, eventually something that's smarter than me will give me the right thing to say. I think that thing is probably the unconscious mind, but I trust that there can be some progress. I'm not doing that every single day. I find that I write periodically, and then there are moments where something, maybe I have a lot of time, uninterrupted time for days or weeks or months if I'm on leave or something from teaching, and then I dive into what feels like this intense period of productivity. When I'm not being productive like that, I'm reading or learning something, deciding what bothers me enough to learn about it and wrestle with it might become the next body of work.
There was a French poet, and I can't remember who, but he said, a poet never goes on vacation. That if you're working on poems or a poem, even if you're taking a walk or a shower or brushing the dog, you might not be working on that poem consciously, but chances are that subconsciously or unconsciously you are working on that poem. And I think that anything that passes through the sub or the unconscious and then reemerges is something that's deeper, truer, maybe more truly you, and you might have been surprised by that. So for me, it's kind of all the time.
Maybe one last question. Yeah, way in the back.
My name is Michael. I'd like to thank Tracy.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's a little hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. My question is for each of you. What is one poem out of all the poems ever written, spoken, that you heard or read that inspired you to keep doing what you're doing?
Interesting question. The one poem that inspired you to keep on doing what you're doing.
I don't know that I would call it this to myself, but when I was in college, we talked about this in our last trip, I was made to memorize a number of poems for a class I was taking. One of them was the poem Love 3 by George Herbert. Is that like a 17th century poem? And I don't know it all anymore, but it begins, love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. And then the poem proceeds where, the speaker is like, I'm not worthy, and love says, don't worry. And eventually love is like the host that serves and welcomes this person, this flawed, shameful, or ashamed person. And I think about that poem a lot when I'm trying to think about why we're here. What is it, this thing, human life, about? And I love the idea that there is something that's so on our side and so compassionate that it wants to help us to recognize that, what we're worth. I think about that poem.
I'm going to go back in time too. When I took a Chaucer class as an undergraduate, the first 2 weeks we spent learning how to read, both to ourselves and aloud, Middle English. And it was this immersion in language like I'd never had before. And it was difficult, but it was so rewarding. And I got so deep into that that I think it was the first time I really understood what deep reading was. And maybe it's also a gloss on what deep writing can be. But in my mind, I go back to that time quite often and think about that experience.
Well, before we go off to have a wonderful reception, I want to welcome the mayor of Glasgow, Duke Doty, for the closing remarks. Mayor.
Thank you so much. What could I say to these fine folks? I've given it some thought, because unlike some of you, a poet I am not. I guess I'd like to let you know we're awfully glad you came. It's an honor to get visit with those of such acclaim. We know that you have traveled many roads along your way, seen pyramids and castles and great things upon display. We also think that Glasgow is a place of pure delight. Its rolling hills and lakes are of the things which poets write. Thank you all for coming to our home we hold so dear. We're honored to have had you, and y'all come back, you hear? Sherry Wesley, that's what you get for making me come to the podium after these four incredible wordsmiths. I'm sure you now wish you had assigned me to the punch bowl instead of giving me the closing comments. But we are so thankful that you have been here and you spoke of that hunger that you see in rural communities. And trust me when I tell you that this group that has come out tonight speaks to that hunger in this rural community. So thank you again for being here. I'd like to leave both of you with something to take with you besides that glowing memory of my poem. And I have some gifts. And I have, Tracy, for you, a basket. And in this basket are 2 books from a local author, Mrs. Peggy Goodman, who is one of our board members here at the museum, and a bracelet that is made from silver cutlery. Yes, ma'am. A local artist, Miss Kelly Lee, has made those. And those buttons are buttons that were from this pants factory several years ago, but that lived in this home for some 60 years. So I've noticed it will match your earrings, so you can wear that home if you like. And for you, we have a tie. And that is a special tie to us here in Glasgow. Glasgow has a very strong Scottish history and heritage. That is the tartan plaid that is specific to Glasgow, Kentucky, as well as our sister city, Glasgow, Scotland. There's a history there, and we want to present you with that in the books from Mrs. Goodman as well. So again, we thank you all so much for coming. And I know that on any other day, Frederick, you would be the king. However, today you will play second fiddle, but we thank you nonetheless for coming to be with us. We have so enjoyed the time that you have spent with us. You are very gracious to come to this part of the country, and again, we thank you and welcome you back at any time.
All right, well, the reception's outside, right? So go mingle and talk to our Poets Laureate.